Hi, it's Ramsey Dewey with the JX Fight Club in Shanghai, China, and today I'm going to give my reaction to the recent UFC event here in Shanghai. I went and saw it live. It's the first time the UFC has come to mainland China, and it was kind of a big deal, kind of a historic event. And yeah, when I bought my tickets a few months back, I was really excited to see Anderson Silva fight live because he was supposed to be on the card, but he got cut, unfortunately, because of a banned substance use. Bummer. And he got replaced with Michael Bisping, who just 2 weeks ago fought George St. Pierre, took quite a bit of damage in that fight, and for some reason was allowed to fight again, and spoiler alert, Bisping got knocked out in about 2 minutes. Pretty anticlimactic fight. But let's talk about the rest of the card. Let's talk about the Chinese fighters and the local reaction to it. Now, the pros and the cons of the UFC in China. The pros, the UFC's in China now. That's a big deal. And if they keep putting shows on here, it's going to grow and it's going to grow and it's going to grow. And because of the sheer volume of people here in the People's Republic, we're talking about 1.3 billion people. That's a huge market to add to the sport of mixed martial arts worldwide. And hopefully, eventually, we'll see some big stars coming out of China. I mean, it's inevitable with this many people and how fast the sport is growing. The real question is when. When I first got here to China about 9 years ago, I figured it would take about 20 years before we really saw any good fighters coming out of China. I mean, people who would be top contenders. Now it's been almost a decade, and we finally have a couple of guys in there, a couple of guys who are okay, but nobody who's really a top contender, nobody who's challenging for the title. Okay, now some of the cons. One of the big cons about this show, especially on the undercard, is that the UFC made the exact same mistake that all of the local Chinese MMA shows have been making for years, which is they are trying to promote local fighters. The show has had a very specific agenda, which is to sell the UFC to the Chinese. And the way they're trying to do that is through nationalism. In other words, they want to make the locals look awesome so that the local people will get on board. I mean, we saw the same thing with Dan Hardy back in the day when the UFC was trying to get its foot in the door in England. And so they tried to make a big star out of Dan Hardy. They gave him a title shot against George St. Pierre when he probably didn't deserve it. And, oh man, that was problematic to me. I mean, just watching that fight, I had issues with that fight. I'll talk about that another time. But what we had, especially on the undercard, was some really bad fights, to be honest. There were 3 Chinese fighters in a row who got their butts kicked by pretty subpar competition. Guys who aren't necessarily UFC caliber. I mean, I really felt like I was watching some amateur stuff. Like it didn't feel like watching a UFC event, to be honest. It felt like watching a local amateur show where they roll out some foreign English teachers who practice martial arts on the side a couple days a week, fighting against the local team of Chinese Sanda fighters. And they try to set it up so the Chinese will win to boost national morale. Yay, China! That kind of thing. And it felt cheap. It felt really cheap, to be honest. So we had, again, 3 of the local fighters in a row just get tooled, absolutely tooled by, guys who weren't necessarily that good. The 4th fight with a Chinese fighter, he fought a dude from India who man, I don't know why this guy was in the UFC. Guy was wobbly. It kind of looked like it was his first fight. I mean, it wasn't. I guess he's had some fights over in India in the Super Fight League, which is not a great show. Not a great show, to be honest. But it was pretty mismatched, and this young Chinese guy ended up winning the fight. And it wasn't a good fight. It really wasn't. It was sloppy. It was mismatched. It was tragic, to be honest. But as soon as the local people in that stadium saw one of their own win a UFC fight for the very first time in their home country, man, it was electric. The crowd went nuts. They went crazy, man. Ooh, it was loud. Didn't hear that much cheering again the rest of the night as that very first time a local Chinese fighter won a UFC match in the history of the UFC in the People's Republic of China. And even though it was a crappy fight, it really was, that was a really interesting moment. That was a cool moment to be part of. It's like, wow. Wow, even though, I get it. I get that they're, trying to feed them stepping stones, because they kind of need that right now, I guess. But then, the next fight, blanking on her name, but there was this girl from the Xi'an Sports University. I've seen her fight a few times. Very good Sanda fighter. Oh man, I'm forgetting the name of who she fought. Blanking on a lot of names. A lot of no-name fighters on this card here. Man, then it side kicks to the head, boom, knockback power, right hand counters, front leg sweeps, takedowns. It was a beautiful fight. Beautiful use, probably the best Sanda I have seen in a mixed martial arts fight to date. And that was the first fight that was really competitive. Man, there were a couple of other fights that were interesting. There was a little skinny Russian dude, tall, lanky Russian dude, fighting some Brazilian dude. And I remember my wife looked over me like, oh man, that Russian guy looks like he's going to get killed. He's so skinny. He looks like he would break like a twig. And it was the polar opposite of that. I mean, it was a masterclass in wrestling and striking, and man, good fight. My old buddy Wang Guan, the Dongbei Tiger, he fought Alex Caceres, otherwise known as Bruce Leroy. That was probably the first fight on the card that was really compelling, because one, I know Wang Guan personally. I fought him. He put this hole in my head right there. Talked about that in another video. But man, Wang Guan is a killer, straight up killer. And with about 10 seconds left in the first round, man, he got a takedown and laid some brutal beating on Alex Caceres. I mean, it was very close to being a TKO, but he got saved by the bell. And Wang Guan ended up winning a decision. It was the first time I've seen Wang Guan fight a southpaw. I'm sure he's done it before somewhere in his career. I mean, the guy's had tons of fights. Sanda, Muay Thai, and of course mixed martial arts. But it's the first time I've seen him fight a southpaw, and Wang Guan is so good at timing the right kick, the leg kick, and the body kick that everybody throws. So good at timing that, catching it, countering it, knocking people out that way. But I could tell it was really awkward fighting a southpaw, because southpaws don't do that to you. They're throwing the kick on the other side. So it's hard to catch that kick on the goofy side, right? But he ended up winning, man, got some great right-hand counters in there. So that was a good fight to watch. I mean, that's one of the first one where there was a local fighter where I felt like, okay, this actually does feel like the UFC. And what's his name? Li Jingling. He's a big name here in China, has been for a while. Knocked his opponent out pretty quick, got a TKO. And that got the audience like cheering, of course, because one of their hometown heroes won a fight. But then he jumped over the cage, not to celebrate, not to flaunt, but to run over and give his wife a hug and a kiss, and to hug his young daughter. And of course, the cameras panned over to it immediately, like, get this on film. And they kept that on film for a while, and the referees are like, get back in the cage, get back in the cage. He's like, celebrating with his wife and his kid, his family right there, and that was a very touching moment. And man, the crowd went nuts over that. Li Jingling, he got back in the cage finally and gave a very rousing patriotic speech saying to all the people in this stadium, this victory is yours. It is not mine, but yours. Very, very communist thing to say. Share the success. It's not just mine, it's ours, it's yours. And, yeah, people went nuts over that. Man, people loved that. Yeah. So, overall, interesting event, but at the same time, I didn't really feel for much of the event like I was watching the UFC. Again, it felt like a local fight show dressed up like the UFC, with the UFC logo slapped over the top. Here in China, in Shanghai especially, we see so many copycats of everything, really. We see fake brands, we see fake off-brands, we see counterfeits of almost everything. I mean, you can buy fake UFC merchandise everywhere, for example. And, it kind of felt like something like that. Like, is this the real thing, or is it just like some, Chinese off-brand that just plagiarized and slapped the sticker on it? Anyway, I predict it'll probably take another decade before the sport really takes off in this country. But when it does, man, watch out. You can do a lot of things with 1.3 billion people behind you. One other thing, just one other comment about the UFC that I found really interesting. When I first started fighting in China, the crowds were silent. There was no cheering, there was no booing. It was like dead silence. You could hear a pin drop. It was just like thud, 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 thud. Thuds of the punches and kicks and the breathing of the fighters on stage. And that was weird. It was eerie. It was kind of spooky. And occasionally you'd hear maybe some noise if there was some big move, like a big throw or something. But for the most part, not a lot of interaction from the crowd. But that wasn't the case at the UFC event. And what surprised me the most was how the audience responded to the grappling. The first time there was a submission attempt, a guy tried a guillotine choke, and the crowd responded. They were like, oh, wow. There were some cheers and boos and a big response from that. I was like, whoa, they know what that is. Because 10 years ago, nobody knew what grappling was. I mean, except for, say, Brazilian jiu-jitsu enthusiasts, and there were just a few of those. And later in another fight, there was a triangle choke attempt. And there was a big reaction from the crowd, like, whoa, he got out of that, whoa. And I realized, hey, they know what a triangle choke is. These people understand what submission fighting looks like. That wasn't the case 10 years ago. That wasn't the case 5 years ago. But, man, the general public's understanding of the sport has gone a long way. That's kind of a big deal. So, man, another 10 years. Sky's the limit here. So, well, China's definitely got off to a rocky start as far as mixed martial arts and the UFC is concerned. I think it's got a promising future. So tell me what you think in the comments down below, if you saw the event especially. Thank you for watching. Get out there and train.